The beeping of machines pulled me back from somewhere dark and far away. My chest felt like someone had cracked it open with a crowbar, and the taste of metal coated my tongue. Through the haze of medication, I heard voices drifting from the hallway outside my room, familiar voices that made my heart flutter with relief. Michael was here. My son had come. "The realtor said we could close by Friday if we accept their offer," he was saying, his voice carrying that business-like tone he used at his insurance office. "It's $20,000 under asking, but honestly, Mom's house needs work anyway." Mom's house. I tried to process those words through the fog in my brain. The cardiac surgeon had said the operation went well, that I'd be home in a week, maybe 2. Why was Michael talking about selling my house? "Did you get the jewelry appraised?" Jessica's voice was sharper, more urgent. My daughter-in-law had never liked visiting me, always checking her phone during Sunday dinners, but now she sounded almost excited. "Your mother had some valuable pieces. That emerald ring alone should cover Emma's orthodontist bills." The emerald ring? My grandmother's ring, the one I'd promised to pass down to Sarah when she got married. The one I still wore every day, even here in this hospital bed. I tried to lift my hand to check, but my fingers felt weighted down with lead. "Sarah signed everything yesterday," Michael continued, and something cold settled in my stomach. I told her what the doctor said, that Mom probably wouldn't wake up, and if she did, she'd never be the same. Poor kid was crying so hard she could barely hold the pen, but she knows it's what Mom would want. What I would want. I wanted to scream, to sit up and tell them I was right here, that I could hear every word, but my body felt disconnected from my mind. The machines kept their steady rhythm while my world crumbled in whispers just outside my door. "Should we tell people about the memorial service?" Jessica asked. "I already ordered flowers for Saturday." Memorial service. They were planning my funeral while I lay breathing 10 feet away. I kept my eyes closed and listened as they divided up my life like pieces of a puzzle they were eager to solve. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room brought back another memory. Michael's cologne from 6 months ago, that expensive stuff Jessica had bought him for Christmas. He'd been wearing it the day everything changed, the day I'd collapsed in my kitchen while making his favorite pot roast. I could still see him rushing through my front door, his face twisted with what I'd thought was worry. His hands had shaken as he helped me to the couch, and I'd felt so grateful that my son was there, that he cared enough to drop everything and come running. How blind I'd been to the calculating gleam behind those concerned eyes. "Mom, you can't keep living alone like this," he'd said that afternoon, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. "What if I hadn't called when I did? What if you'd been lying on that floor for hours?" The irony burned now, listening to those remembered words while he planned my memorial service in the hallway. He'd called that day because Jessica had seen my neighbor Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store, mentioning that I'd looked pale lately. Not because he'd been worried about his mother, but because Jessica had sent him to check on their future inheritance. That first heart episode had been mild, according to Dr. Martinez. A warning, he'd called it, easily managed with medication and some lifestyle changes. But Michael had acted like I was on death's door, insisting on driving me to every appointment, taking notes during every consultation, asking pointed questions about my prognosis when he thought I wasn't listening. "I think we should talk about getting your affairs in order," he'd said during one of those long drives home from the cardiologist. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, but his voice stayed carefully casual. "Just in case. You know how these things can go." I'd reached over and patted his arm, thinking my son was just scared of losing me. "Oh, honey, I'm not going anywhere yet," Dr. Martinez said with the right medication. "People live for decades with conditions like mine." The muscle in his jaw had tightened then, just for a second, before he'd forced that concerned smile back onto his face. "Of course, Mom. I just want to make sure you're protected." Protected. The word tasted bitter now. Within a week, he'd moved his favorite armchair from his apartment into my living room, claiming he wanted to stay close in case I had another episode. Jessica had helped him bring over boxes of his things, her sharp eyes cataloging my furniture, my china cabinet, the antique secretary desk that had belonged to my mother. She'd run her fingers along the mahogany surface like she was already measuring it for her dining room. "This is such a beautiful piece," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Michael, didn't you say your grandmother was quite the collector?" I should have seen it then, the way she'd opened every drawer, examining the contents with the thoroughness of an appraiser. But I'd been so touched by their sudden attention, so grateful to have family close by after years of Sunday dinners, where they'd seemed eager to leave. Michael had started small, offering to balance my checkbook because the numbers were getting complicated, suggesting he be added to my bank account just for emergencies, convincing me to let him handle my insurance paperwork because these companies try to take advantage of older folks. Each request had come with a story: a neighbor who'd been scammed, an elderly friend who'd mixed up her medications, a news report about financial predators targeting seniors. He'd wrapped each manipulation in such tender concern that I'd felt selfish for even hesitating. "I just want to take care of you the way you took care of me," he'd said, his voice breaking just enough to make my heart ache. "You sacrificed so much when Dad died, working 2 jobs to put me and Sarah through school. Let me do this for you." The memory of those words made my chest tighten with something deeper than the surgical pain. I had sacrificed for my children. I'd given up my dreams of travel, of pursuing my master's degree, of dating again after James died. Every dollar had gone toward their futures: Michael's business degree, Sarah's teaching certification, down payments for their first homes. I'd worn the same winter coat for 15 years so Michael could have new clothes for job interviews, and this was how he repaid that love. The second heart episode had been worse, landing me in the emergency room at 2 a.m. Michael had appeared within minutes, somehow already dressed and alert, as if he'd been expecting the call. He'd handled everything with practiced efficiency, talking to doctors, signing forms, making decisions about my care with an authority I didn't remember giving him. "We need to discuss long-term care options," he'd told Dr. Martinez while I was still groggy from the medication. "My mother's been having some confusion lately." Memory issues. I'd never had memory issues. But the doctor had nodded sympathetically, making notes in my chart while Michael painted a picture of a woman who couldn't be trusted to manage her own life. "She left the stove on last week," he'd continued, his lie delivered with such practiced sincerity that I'd almost believed it myself. "And she's been having trouble with her medications. Sometimes taking double doses, sometimes forgetting entirely." The betrayal of those words hit me harder than the chest pain had. He'd been building a case against my competency, laying the groundwork for what I now realized had always been his endgame. Sarah had visited that day, her eyes red with tears she'd tried to hide. She'd held my hand and whispered about how scared she was, how lost she'd be without me. Her grief had been real, raw, nothing like Michael's calculated performance. But even then, he'd worked his poison into her ear. "Sarah's taking this really hard," he'd told Dr. Martinez just outside my room, his voice pitched low but not low enough. "She's always been the emotional one. I think it might be better if I handle the medical communications going forward. Keep things simple for her. Simple. Like cutting my younger daughter out of decisions about my own care." The third episode had been the worst, the one that had landed me in surgery. But even as they'd wheeled me toward the operating room, I'd seen something in Michael's eyes that should have terrified me. Relief. Not the relief of knowing I was getting help, but the relief of a man who saw his plan finally coming to fruition. Now, lying in this bed while he divided up my possessions in the hallway, I understood the full scope of his deception. Every concerned gesture, every worried phone call, every act of filial devotion had been performance art designed to position himself as the grieving but responsible son when the inevitable happened. Except the inevitable hadn't happened. I was still here, still breathing, still thinking clearly enough to see through 6 months of lies. The door to my room creaked open, and a young nurse with kind eyes peered in. "Mrs. Sullivan? I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wanted to let you know that your lawyer, Mr. Patterson, has called several times asking about your condition." She glanced toward the hallway where Michael's voice still carried. "Your son told us that all medical information should go through him first, but Mr. Patterson seemed quite insistent about speaking with you directly." My heart hammered against my ribs as the nurse's words sank in. Mr. Patterson was trying to reach me, but Michael had blocked him out. The phone felt cold against my ear as I pressed it deeper into the pillow, muffling my whispered conversation. After the nurse had left, I'd waited 2 agonizing hours for Michael and Jessica's voices to fade down the hallway before I'd reached for the bedside phone with shaking fingers. Betty Kowalski had been my neighbor for 37 years. She'd brought casseroles when James died, had watched my children grow up in her backyard, had shared countless cups of coffee over kitchen table conversations that lasted until evening. If anyone would tell me the truth, it would be Betty. "Dorothy?" Her voice cracked with disbelief when she heard my whisper. "Oh, honey, oh, my sweet girl, is it really you?" The raw emotion in her words made my throat tighten. "It's me, Betty." "I'm alive. I'm in the hospital, but I'm very much alive." Silence stretched between us for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then came the sound I'd been dreading. Betty crying. Great gasping sobs that told me everything I'd feared was true. "They said you were gone," she choked out between tears. "Michael came by Tuesday morning, eyes all red, telling everyone you'd passed peacefully in your sleep Monday night, said you'd had another heart attack and that this time—" Her voice broke completely. Monday night. I'd been in recovery Monday night, groggy but breathing, watching nurses check my vitals every hour. While I'd been counting the holes in the ceiling tiles and wondering when I could go home, my son had been making condolence calls to the neighborhood. Betty, what else did he tell people? My fingers gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "Oh, Dorothy, I'm so sorry." I should have questioned it, should have called the hospital myself, but Michael seemed so broken up about it all. Her voice caught on a sob. "He said you'd left everything to him and Jessica, that there wasn't going to be a big funeral because you'd wanted something small and private. Just family. Just family." The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah was family. My sister Ruth in Phoenix was family. My cousin Margaret, who'd driven 3 hours every Christmas for the past decade, was family. But apparently, in Michael's version of events, family meant only the people who stood to gain from my death. "What about the neighbors?" I whispered, afraid of the answer, but needing to know. Betty's voice grew smaller, more ashamed. "There was a gathering. Wednesday evening. Michael and Jessica hosted it at their apartment, said it was what you would have wanted. Nothing fancy. They put out photos of you, had some of your favorite flowers. Mrs. Henderson brought that potato salad you always liked at the block parties." A celebration of life. While I'd been learning to walk from my bed to the bathroom without feeling dizzy, they'd been passing around my photographs and sharing memories of my supposedly deceased self. The violation of it struck me speechless. "Dorothy? Are you still there?" "I'm here." The words came out strangled, barely audible. "Jessica showed everyone your emerald ring," Betty continued, her voice growing more horrified as she spoke. "She was wearing it. Said you'd given it to her before they thought you died. She kept touching it while she talked about how much you'd meant to the family, how you'd wanted her to have something to remember you by." My grandmother's ring. The ring that had never left my finger, not even for surgery. I looked down at my hand now and saw only the pale band of skin where it had sat for 43 years. They'd taken it right off my unconscious body. "There's more," Betty said, and I could hear her steeling herself for what came next. Sarah was there, poor thing. She looked like she'd been crying for days, could barely speak, but Jessica kept putting her arm around her, talking about how grateful they all were that you'd made your wishes so clear before you passed. My wishes? What wishes? I'd made my will years ago with Mr. Patterson, splitting everything equally between Michael and Sarah, with specific bequests for my grandchildren's college funds and several charities I'd supported for decades. I'd never expressed any wish to have my jewelry divided up before my body was cold, never wanted a memorial service where people I'd known for decades would be lied to about my final moments. Betty, did Michael say anything about legal matters, about the house, or... "Oh, honey." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He mentioned that the house was going to be too much for Jessica to manage along with their apartment lease, so they'd probably have to sell it. Said you'd understood it was the practical choice, with the kids' college funds to think about and all. The practical choice. My home of 42 years, where I'd raised my children and buried my husband's ashes in the rose garden, had been reduced to a practical choice, a line item in their financial planning. What about Sarah? Did she seem to know about these plans?" Betty paused, and I could almost see her choosing her words carefully. Sarah looked confused, I guess. When Jessica talked about selling the house, Sarah asked if they were sure that's what you'd wanted. Michael jumped in real quick, said you'd discussed it all with him during your last hospital stay, made him promise to help Jessica with all the difficult decisions. Difficult decisions. Like erasing my life before I'd even left it. "There's something else, Dorothy." Betty's voice grew even smaller. "About Sarah." My heart clenched. What about Sarah? She kept asking to see some document, said she wanted to make sure everything was being handled the way you'd wanted. Michael got, I don't know how to describe it, firm, I guess. He told her there was no need for her to worry about legal paperwork, that it would just upset her to see all the medical terminology about why they thought I'd what, Betty? Died, honey. Michael told her the doctors had said you were brain dead after the surgery, that there was no chance of recovery. He said signing the power of attorney was the kindest thing she could do, that it would let you go peacefully without being kept alive by machines. Brain dead. The word echoed in my mind like a death knell. Michael had told my daughter I was brain dead, had convinced her that signing away my autonomy was an act of mercy rather than betrayal. Sarah was sobbing when she signed those papers, Betty continued, her own voice thick with tears. She kept saying she didn't want to let you go, that maybe the doctors were wrong. But Michael kept telling her that holding on would be selfish, that you'd made him promise to help her do the right thing when the time came. The right thing. My younger daughter, my gentle Sarah, who'd never hurt a fly, had been manipulated into believing that betraying her mother was the right thing to do. Betty, I need you to listen to me very carefully. My voice had found strength I didn't know I possessed. I need you to call Mr. Harold Patterson, my lawyer. His number should be in the phone book. Tell him I'm alive and that I need to speak with him immediately. Of course, honey. Of course I will. And Betty? Don't tell anyone else that I called. Not yet. I need to understand exactly what Michael has done before. Before what? Before I confronted him? Before I called the police? Before I figured out how to undo the damage he'd inflicted on my life and my family. I understand, Betty said. But Dorothy, you should know there are people who want to help you. Mrs. Henderson has been asking questions about why there wasn't a proper obituary in the paper. And your mailman, Tony, mentioned that your mail was being forwarded to Michael's address awful quick for someone who just lost their mother. People were noticing. The lies Michael had built his plan on were already starting to crumble under the weight of their own inconsistencies. After I hung up the phone, I lay in the darkness of my hospital room, staring at the ceiling and processing everything Betty had told me. My son hadn't just stolen my money and my possessions, he'd stolen my reputation, my relationships, my very identity. He'd made me disappear while I was still breathing, erasing 40 years of friendships and community connections with a few well-placed lies and crocodile tears. But worse than that, he'd used my own love against me. He'd weaponized my devotion to my children, twisting it into a tool of manipulation that had left Sarah believing she was honoring my wishes by signing away my rights. The next morning brought a new horror. The same kind nurse who'd mentioned Mr. Patterson's calls appeared at my bedside with a clipboard and a worried expression. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm sorry to bother you again, but there's been some confusion with your records." She glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "The business office received a call this morning from someone claiming to be handling your estate. They were asking about transferring your remaining medical bills to an estate account and wanted to know about releasing your body to a funeral home." My body? They were already trying to claim my body while I was using it to breathe. "Did they give a name?" I managed to ask. "Michael Sullivan. He said he was your son and that he had power of attorney to handle all your affairs." She hesitated, studying my face. "Mrs. Sullivan, you seem very alert and capable of making your own decisions. Is there something going on that I should know about?" Before I could answer, her pager buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. "I have to go, but Mrs. Sullivan, your lawyer, called again this morning. Mr. Patterson. He seemed very concerned when I told him about the power of attorney situation. He said something about needing to verify some documents that didn't match his records." As she hurried away, my mind raced with new implications. Michael wasn't just stealing from me, he was actively trying to complete the fiction of my death. How long before he contacted the funeral home? How long before he tried to convince the hospital to disconnect machines I wasn't even connected to? But Mr. Patterson was asking questions. My lawyer, who'd known me for 15 years, who'd helped me write my will and update it after each grandchild was born, was questioning documents that didn't match his records. I reached for the phone again, my hand steadier now with purpose. But as I lifted the receiver, I heard familiar footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Michael's voice, closer than it had been yesterday, talking to someone about arrangements and timelines and finalizing everything by Friday. Today was Thursday morning. Whatever Michael was planning to finalize, he intended to do it within 24 hours. The wheelchair squeaked against the hospital's polished floor as Betty pushed me toward the exit, my discharge papers clutched in my trembling hands. The nurse at the desk had looked skeptical when I'd insisted on leaving against Dr. Martinez's recommendations, but I'd signed every waiver they'd put in front of me with a steady hand that belied the storm raging in my chest. "Are you sure about this, honey?" Betty whispered as the automatic doors slid open, letting in the crisp October air that felt like freedom after 4 days of recycled hospital atmosphere. "Maybe you should stay another day. Let them run those tests they wanted." I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders and shook my head. "If I stay here 1 more hour, Michael will have me declared legally dead and buried before I can stop him." The words tasted bitter, but they carried the weight of truth. "I need to see what he's done to my house." Betty's old Buick smelled like vanilla air freshener and decades of loyalty. She'd been my lifeline through James's funeral, through the children's teenage years, through every crisis that had shaped the last 4 decades of my life. Now she was helping me navigate the most surreal crisis of all, returning from my own supposed death to survey the damage. The drive to Maple Street took 12 minutes, the same route I'd traveled thousands of times over the years. But everything looked different through the lens of betrayal. The corner where I'd taught Michael to ride his bike seemed smaller somehow. The playground where I'd pushed Sarah on swings for hours had been updated with bright new equipment that I didn't recognize. Even the familiar streets felt foreign, as if I'd been gone for years instead of days. My house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, looking exactly the same from the outside. The same blue shutters James had painted the summer before he died. The same rose bushes I'd tended every weekend for 20 years. The same mailbox with the Sullivans painted in my careful cursive. But something was wrong with the driveway. "Where's your car?" Betty asked, voicing the question that had already sent ice through my veins. My reliable Honda Accord, the one I'd bought with my retirement savings just 2 years ago, was gone. In its place sat Michael's pickup truck and Jessica's red SUV, parked as if they owned the space. "They moved in," I whispered, the reality hitting me like a physical blow. "They actually moved into my house." Betty parked across the street and we sat in silence for a moment, staring at what had been my home. Through the living room window, I could see shadows moving around people going about their daily lives in my space, among my things, as if I'd never existed. "The key," I said suddenly, remembering the spare house key I'd hidden under the ceramic frog by the back door for emergencies. "If they haven't found it..." Betty helped me out of the car, her arm steady under mine as we made our way around to the backyard. My legs felt unsteady, whether from the surgery or the shock of seeing strangers' belongings mixed with my furniture through the windows. I couldn't tell. The ceramic frog sat exactly where I'd left it, next to the hosta that was just beginning to turn yellow with autumn. My fingers shook as I lifted it, and there was the key, small, silver, and overlooked in Michael's rush to claim his inheritance. The back door opened with the same soft click it always had, but stepping into my own kitchen felt like trespassing. Jessica's expensive coffee maker sat where my old percolator used to be. Her fancy ceramic canisters had replaced the mismatched jars where I'd kept my sugar and flour. Even the dish towels were different designer ones with patterns I'd never seen before. "This is wrong," Betty breathed behind me. "This is just wrong." I moved through my house like a ghost, cataloging the changes with a mixture of heartbreak and rage. My family photos had been removed from the mantel and replaced with wedding pictures of Michael and Jessica. My reading chair, the one where I'd nursed both my children, where I'd read bedtime stories and helped with homework, had been shoved into a corner to make room for Jessica's modern sectional sofa. In the bedroom that had been mine and James's for 38 years, I found Jessica's clothes hanging in my closet. Her perfume bottles crowded my dresser. Her jewelry box sat where my grandmother's music box had played the same melody every night for 4 decades. "Where is everything?" I asked the empty room, but I already knew the answer. My life had been packed away, stored or discarded to make room for theirs. The worst discovery waited in my husband's old office. Michael had turned it into a command center of sorts, with filing cabinets and a computer setup that looked more professional than anything he'd ever had in his apartment. But it was the open folder on the desk that made my knees buckle. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, bearing my forged signature on page after page. A power of attorney dated 3 days before my surgery, one that gave Michael authority over not just my medical care, but my entire estate. A revised will that looked similar to the one I'd signed with Mr. Patterson, but with crucial changes that jumped off the page like accusations. The charitable donations I'd carefully planned, $5,000 to the animal shelter where I'd volunteered, $3,000 to the literacy program at the library, $10,000 to the scholarship fund I'd established in James's memory, all of them had been deleted. In their place, everything went to Michael, with Sarah receiving only a token $1,000 and my grandmother's china. My hands shook as I flipped through more pages. A death certificate bearing yesterday's date, a letter to the Social Security Administration requesting termination of my benefits, even a pre-written obituary that painted me as a devoted mother who'd bravely battled heart disease before passing peacefully surrounded by loving family. Surrounded by loving family. The lie burned worse than the theft. Dorothy. Betty's voice carried from the kitchen, urgent and worried. "Someone's coming up the driveway." I grabbed Betty's phone from her purse and started photographing the documents as fast as my shaking hands would allow. Each click of the camera captured another piece of evidence, another layer of my son's betrayal documented in black and white. The sound of a car door slamming echoed through the house, followed by heavy footsteps on the front porch. Michael's key turned in the lock, my lock, in my house that he'd stolen while I was unconscious. "Mom?" His voice carried through the rooms, and I heard something I'd never heard before in his tone. Fear. "Mom, are you here?" He knew. Somehow, he'd discovered I was alive. I kept photographing, my finger pressing the camera button with desperate urgency. The fake death certificate, the forged will, the power of attorney documents with signatures that looked like mine, but carried the slight tremor of someone else's hand. Betty mentioned she saw lights on. Jessica's voice joined Michael's, high-pitched with anxiety. But that's impossible. Nobody has keys except me. The realization that I still had rights to my own home hadn't occurred to them. In their rush to claim their inheritance, they'd forgotten that the person they'd buried was still legally alive, still legally the owner of everything they'd stolen. Michael's footsteps moved through the house with purpose now, no longer the casual gait of someone comfortable in his own space. He was searching, room by room, and it would only be moments before he reached the office where Betty and I stood frozen among the evidence of his crimes. "Get the folder," I whispered to Betty, shoving her phone back into her hands. "Take pictures of everything while I—" The footsteps stopped just outside the office door. Through the crack beneath it, I could see Michael's shadow, motionless and waiting. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice carrying a cold certainty that made my blood freeze. "We need to talk." But as I stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn, I realized something that Michael didn't know, something that might be the key to everything. He'd found out I was alive, but he had no idea I'd found his folder. The small recording device felt warm in my palm as I slipped it into my cardigan pocket, its red light blinking once before disappearing beneath the knitted fabric. Betty had pressed it into my hands that morning with shaking fingers, whispering that her late husband's old equipment might be our only protection against whatever was coming. "He'll try to make you think you're confused," she'd said, her voice tight with 40 years of watching neighborhood dramas unfold. "Men like that, they count on women our age not fighting back." Now sitting in Betty's living room with the folder of Michael's forged documents spread across her coffee table, I understood what she'd meant. My son would walk through that door expecting to find the same woman he'd manipulated for months, fragile, trusting, eager to believe his lies. Instead, he'd find someone who'd seen the evidence of his betrayal, photographed in black and white. The knock came at precisely 2 o'clock, 3 sharp raps that somehow managed to sound both demanding and entitled. Through Betty's lace curtains, I could see Michael on the porch, his shoulders rigid with the posture of a man preparing for battle. He'd changed since our hospital encounter. His usual rumpled appearance had been replaced by a crisp, button-down shirt and his best khakis, as if dressing professionally might lend authority to whatever story he'd prepared. Betty moved to answer the door, but I caught her wrist. "Let me," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "It's time I stopped letting other people handle my problems." The door felt heavier than I remembered as I pulled it open, and for a moment, Michael and I simply stared at each other across the threshold. His eyes searched my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Not the loving concern of a son seeing his mother alive and well, but the calculating assessment of a man whose plans had been disrupted. "Mom." The word came out flat, emotionless. "You shouldn't have left the hospital." "Hello, Michael." I stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter Betty's living room. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." He moved past me with careful steps, his gaze immediately drawn to the documents I'd deliberately left visible on the coffee table. I watched his jaw tighten as he recognized his own handwriting on the forged papers, watched his fingers curl into fists at his sides. You went through my things, he said, and there wasn't even a pretense of shame in his voice. You broke into your own house. My house, I interrupted, settling into Betty's armchair with as much dignity as I could manage. My house, my belongings, my life that you've been dismantling piece by piece while I was unconscious. Michael's face shifted through several expressions: surprise, calculation, something that might have been panic before settling on the wounded look he'd perfected as a teenager. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The surgery, the medications, they can cause confusion in people your age. Dr. Martinez warned me this might happen. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a split second I almost doubted myself. Almost. But then I remembered Betty's phone calls, the neighbors at my supposed memorial service, the emerald ring that had been stolen from my unconscious finger. Which part am I confused about, Michael? I kept my voice level, professional, the tone I'd used as head librarian when dealing with difficult patrons. The part where you forged my signature on a power of attorney? The part where you created a fake death certificate? Or the part where you threw a celebration of life party while I was learning to walk again after surgery? His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and hard underneath. You don't understand the legal complexities. I understand that you stole my car. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. I understand that you moved into my house and replaced my furniture with yours. I understand that you told Sarah I was brain dead to trick her into signing away my rights. That hit home. Michael's face flushed red, and he took a step closer to my chair. Sarah was falling apart. She needed someone to make the hard decisions, and you weren't exactly available for consultation. Because you told everyone I was dead. The shout escaped before I could stop it, 40 years of maternal patience finally snapping under the weight of his betrayal. Michael jumped back as if I'd struck him, his carefully constructed composure cracking. I was trying to protect the family, he said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. You don't know what Jessica's been going through, what she's been threatening. She said if I didn't secure our future, she'd take the kids and leave. She'd make sure I never saw Emma and Tyler again. There it was, the blame shift I'd been expecting. Everything was Jessica's fault. Poor Michael was just a victim of circumstances beyond his control. It was the same story he'd told when he'd been caught cheating on his college entrance exams, when he'd been fired from his first job for padding his expense reports, when he'd borrowed money from Sarah and never paid it back. So Jessica made you forge documents, I said, letting skepticism color every word. Jessica forced you to steal my grandmother's ring off my unconscious body. Jessica held a gun to your head while you planned my funeral. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I leaned forward, letting him see the steel that had carried me through raising 2 children alone after James died. You've always been willing to take shortcuts, Michael. Remember when you were 16 and you stole $20 from my purse, then blamed it on Sarah? Remember when you got that DUI at 22 and begged me not to tell your sister because it would disappoint her? His face was chalk white now, all pretense of victimhood abandoned. That's different. I was young, I made mistakes. You're 43 years old, I said. When do the mistakes become choices? The recording device in my pocket captured every word, every admission, every moment of his crumbling defense. Betty sat silent in the corner, a witness to the unraveling of a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of manipulation. Jessica didn't make you do anything, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. She just gave you permission to do what you've always wanted to do. Take what wasn't yours, blame someone else when you got caught, and count on family loyalty to protect you from the consequences. Michael's hands shook as he ran them through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood tantrums. You don't know what it's like, trying to provide for a family on an insurance adjuster's salary. The kids need things, college funds, opportunities. So you decided to kill me for them. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and inescapable. Michael's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and for the first time in our conversation, he had nothing to say. "That's what this was," I pressed on, each word carefully chosen and deliberately delivered. "Murder. You decided I was worth more to you dead than alive, so you created the legal framework to make it happen. The only thing you didn't count on was me waking up and walking away. I never meant to hurt you," he whispered, and for a moment he sounded like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "I love you, Mom. Everything I did was to protect the family, to make sure everyone was taken care of." "You excluded your sister from my will," I said, cutting through his protestations. "The daughter who calls me every Sunday, who visits every holiday, who's never asked me for anything, you reduced her inheritance to $1,000 and a set of china. How is that protecting family?" Michael's face crumpled, and I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. Not the successful businessman he pretended to be, not the devoted family man he played on social media, but a middle-aged man who'd built his entire life on taking advantage of people who loved him too much to see who he really was. "Sarah has her teaching job," he said weakly. "She doesn't need the money like we do. Jessica's parents cut us off after the wedding, and with Tyler's learning disabilities requiring special programs—" "Stop." The word came out like a blade. "Just stop making excuses and take responsibility for what you've done." The sound of car doors slamming in Betty's driveway cut through our confrontation like a knife through silk. Through the window, I could see a young woman with shoulder-length brown hair walking toward the house, her face creased with confusion and worry. Sarah. My youngest daughter had found me. Michael spun toward the window, his face cycling through panic, calculation, and something that looked almost like relief. "She doesn't know," he said quickly, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Sarah still thinks you died and came back somehow. If we tell her together, explain that you were confused, that the medications made you paranoid." The front door opened before I could respond, and Sarah's voice called out across Betty's living room like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Mom!" The word cracked with disbelief and desperate hope. "Mom, is it really you?" Sarah's hands trembled against the doorframe as she stared at me across Betty's living room, her face cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that looked almost like terror. "The real estate agent had called her an hour ago," she said, confused about showing a house owned by someone who was supposedly dead, and now my youngest daughter stood frozen in the doorway like she'd seen a ghost, which, in a way, she had. "Mom?" The word came out cracked and broken, barely more than a whisper. "They told me you were gone. Michael said the doctors said you were brain dead, that there was no hope, that signing the papers was the only way to let you go peacefully." I rose from Betty's armchair, every muscle in my body protesting the movement, but I needed to reach my daughter. Sarah had always been the gentle one, the one who cried when she stepped on ants, who brought home stray cats and wounded birds. The idea that she'd been manipulated into betraying her own mother was breaking her apart right in front of me. "I'm here, sweetheart," I said, crossing the room in 3 quick steps to pull her into my arms. "I'm alive, I'm okay, and none of this is your fault." Sarah collapsed against me, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. "I signed the papers," she choked out against my shoulder. "Michael said it was what you wanted, that you'd made him promise to help me make the hard choices. But I killed you. I signed away your life." "No." The word came out fierce, protective, the voice I'd used when she was small and other children had been cruel to her at school. "Michael lied to you. He manipulated you into believing something that wasn't true, and that makes you a victim, not a conspirator." Michael had been silent throughout our reunion, standing near Betty's window like a man watching his execution. But Sarah's words seemed to jolt him back to life, and he stepped forward with his hands raised in a gesture that might have been meant to look peaceful. "Sarah, you're overreacting," he said. his voice taking on that smooth, patronizing tone I'd heard him use with his own children when they asked inconvenient questions. "Mom's confused about what happened. The medications from the surgery can cause paranoia in elderly patients. Don't." Sarah's voice cut through his explanation like a blade, and she pulled away from my embrace to face her brother with eyes that blazed with something I'd never seen in her before. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me the way you gaslight everyone else." Michael's face went white. "Sarah, I don't know what Mom's been telling you." "She hasn't told me anything yet," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But the real estate agent sure had a lot to say. About how you put the house on the market 3 days after the funeral. About how you were pushing for a quick sale because you needed the cash for some investment opportunity. About how you seemed awfully cheerful for someone who'd just lost his mother." The air in Betty's living room felt electric, charged with years of suppressed truth finally breaking free. Michael looked between Sarah and me like a cornered animal, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "I can explain everything," he said, but his voice had lost its authority, becoming high and desperate. The house sale was practical. "Show her the documents," I said quietly, gesturing toward the coffee table where Michael's forged papers lay spread like evidence in a courtroom. "Show her the death certificate you created while I was learning to walk again. Show her the will you altered to steal her inheritance." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the papers, her hand flying to her mouth as she recognized the signatures that looked like mine, but carried the slight tremor of someone else's hand. "You forged Mom's signature," she whispered, and the betrayal in her voice was so raw it made my chest ache. "It's not what it looks like," Michael said, but his protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I was trying to protect the family assets, make sure everything was handled properly. By stealing from your own sister?" Sarah's voice rose to a shout, and I saw decades of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated as less important than her older brother finally exploding to the surface. "By reducing my inheritance to $1,000 while you took everything else." "You don't need the money," Michael shot back, his mask finally slipping completely. "You've got your teaching job, your little apartment, your simple life. Jessica and I have real expenses, real responsibilities. Stop talking." Sarah's command was so sharp, so final that Michael actually took a step backward. "Just stop talking before you make this worse." But he couldn't stop, couldn't help himself from digging deeper. "You always were too sensitive, Sarah. Even when we were kids, you'd blow everything out of proportion, make mountains out of molehills. Like the time you stole my college fund?" Sarah's voice was deadly quiet now. "The $2,000 I'd saved from 3 summers of babysitting that mysteriously disappeared from my bedroom the week before you needed to pay for your fraternity dues?" Michael's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. I stared at my daughter, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. She wasn't the fragile, emotional child Michael had always painted her, as she was a woman who'd been keeping track of his betrayals for decades, waiting for the right moment to speak her truth. "Or the time you borrowed $500 from me for Emma's birthday party and never paid it back," she continued, each word carefully chosen and deliberately delivered. "Or when you told Mom I was too busy to visit during her first heart episode because you wanted to be the only one making decisions about her care." The pattern was becoming clear, years of manipulation and control that went far beyond the current crisis. Michael had been positioning himself as the responsible son and painting Sarah as the unreliable daughter for so long that even I had started to believe his version of events. "Sarah, you're being dramatic." "I'm being honest," she said, and turned back to me with tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have questioned everything, should have demanded to see you before I signed anything, should have trusted my instincts when something felt wrong about his story." I pulled her close again, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "You trusted your brother because you loved him. I said, stroking her hair the way I had when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "That doesn't make you naive. It makes you human." The sound of footsteps on Betty's front porch interrupted our reunion, followed by the authoritative knock of someone who expected to be answered. Through the window, I could see a tall man in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. Harold Patterson, my lawyer, looking exactly the same as he had 15 years ago when I'd first walked into his office to write my will. Betty opened the door with visible relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for hours. "Mr. Patterson, thank goodness you're here." Harold stepped into the living room and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent 4 decades dealing with family crises. His gaze lingered on Michael, who'd gone pale at the sight of him, then moved to the documents spread across the coffee table. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice warm with genuine concern. "When Betty called this morning to tell me you were alive, I have to admit I thought she'd lost her mind. I've been trying to reach you for days." "Michael told the hospital staff that all communication should go through him," I said, watching my son's face grow ashen as the full scope of his deception became clear. Harold nodded grimly and opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder that looked official and intimidating. "I brought your original will, the one we executed in my office 3 years ago. I also brought copies of the documents someone tried to file with the probate court yesterday, documents that bear your signature, but contain provisions I know you never agreed to." He spread the papers on Betty's coffee table next to Michael's forgeries, and the differences were immediately obvious. My real will divided everything equally between my children, included specific provisions for my grandchildren's education funds, and contained detailed instructions for charitable donations that had been completely eliminated from Michael's version. "I've been practicing law for 43 years, Harold continued, his voice taking on the stern tone he probably used in courtrooms. "I've never seen such blatant fraud attempted with such arrogance. Did your son really think I wouldn't notice that a will I'd personally drafted had been altered?" Michael sank into Betty's sofa as if his legs couldn't support him anymore. You can explain it to the district attorney," Harold said, cutting him off. "I've already contacted their office about potential elder abuse and fraud charges. They're very interested in reviewing the evidence." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I watched my firstborn child realize that his carefully constructed scheme hadn't just failed, it had landed him in criminal territory that would destroy everything he'd tried to protect. Sarah's hand found mine, squeezing tight as we absorbed the magnitude of what Harold was telling us. Criminal charges, district attorney, elder abuse. The family crisis that had started with forged documents was about to become a public scandal that would follow Michael for the rest of his life. "The irony," Harold continued, his voice carrying the weight of professional disappointment, "is that if Michael had simply waited for nature to take its course, he would have inherited a substantial sum legally. His greed and impatience have cost him everything." Before anyone could respond to Harold's pronouncement, the sound of car doors slamming echoed through Betty's neighborhood. Through the window, I could see Jessica's red SUV parked behind Harold's sedan, and my daughter-in-law was climbing out with Emma and Tyler in tow, her arms full of shopping bags from what looked like an expensive afternoon at the mall. She was heading straight for Betty's front door, her face bright with the confidence of a woman who believed she'd won the lottery. Jessica's scream pierced Betty's quiet neighborhood when she walked through that front door and saw me sitting calmly in the armchair, very much alive and holding the evidence of her husband's crimes. The shopping bags fell from her hands, spilling children's clothes and expensive electronics across Betty's hardwood floor, while Emma and Tyler stared in confusion at their grandmother, who was supposed to be dead. "You can't be here," she whispered, her face cycling through shock, denial, and something that looked almost like rage. "Michael said you died. We went to your funeral. I'm wearing your ring." She held up her left hand, and there it was, my grandmother's emerald ring, gleaming on a finger that had no right to wear it. The sight of it sitting there, stolen from my unconscious body and flaunted like a trophy, sent a surge of cold anger through my chest that surprised me with its intensity. "Take it off," I said quietly, and something in my voice made both children step behind their mother. "Take off my grandmother's ring and put it on the table." Jessica's fingers closed protectively around the emerald, her knuckles going white. "Michael gave this to me. He said it was what you wanted, that you'd told him I should have something to remember you by." "Michael told you a lot of things," I said, gesturing toward the documents spread across Betty's coffee table. Most of them were lies designed to steal everything I'd worked for my entire life, including that ring. The next few minutes passed in a blur of accusations, denials, and the ugly truth of what Michael and Jessica had attempted to do. Mr. Patterson laid out the legal reality with the clinical precision of a man who'd seen too many family betrayals, criminal fraud charges, elder abuse prosecution, the complete invalidation of every document they'd tried to file. Jessica's world crumbled in real time as she realized the magnitude of their situation. Her husband faced years in prison. Their financial future, built on the assumption of my inheritance, had evaporated. Even her own family, when they learned about the fraud, would distance themselves from the scandal that was about to engulf them both. The children, Emma and Tyler, sat silent through most of the confrontation, their young minds trying to process why Grandma Dorothy was alive when Daddy had said she was in heaven, why Mommy was crying, why everyone was angry. I watched them from across the room and felt my heart break for the innocent victims of their parents' greed. The legal machinery moved with surprising swiftness once Mr. Patterson filed the formal complaints. Michael was arrested 3 days later at his insurance office, led away in handcuffs while his colleagues watched from their cubicles. The local newspaper ran a small item about the arrest, "Local man charged with elder abuse in inheritance fraud." But the damage to his reputation was far more extensive than any headline could capture. Jessica discovered that being married to a man charged with defrauding his own mother made her unemployable in her field of pharmaceutical sales. Companies that had once courted her expertise suddenly found reasons to withdraw job offers or terminate contract negotiations. Her own parents, horrified by the scandal and ashamed of their daughter's role in it, cut off contact and refused to help with childcare or financial support. The house sale was invalidated within a week, much to the frustration of the buyers who'd already put down earnest money. My accounts were unfrozen, my car was returned from wherever they'd hidden it, and slowly, piece by piece, my life began to reassemble itself into something recognizable. But I couldn't go back to the way things had been before. The house on Maple Street where I'd raised my children and buried my husband's ashes in the rose garden felt contaminated by the betrayal that had taken place within its walls. Every room held memories of Michael's manipulation. Every corner reminded me of how blind I'd been to his true nature. Sarah helped me pack my belongings on a crisp November morning, 6 weeks after the confrontation at Betty's house. We worked in comfortable silence, wrapping my china in newspaper and sorting through decades of accumulated memories. She handled each item with reverence, as if she understood that we were dismantling not just a household, but the remnants of a trust that could never be fully rebuilt. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," she said, carefully placing my mother's tea set into a padded box. "The way Michael would always steer conversations away from your finances when I visited. How he'd get that tight look around his eyes whenever you mentioned updating your will. The way he'd interrupt when you tried to tell me about your doctor's appointments." I folded one of James's old sweaters, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered in the wool after all these years. "We see what we want to see in the people we love," I said, "especially our children." I spent 43 years making excuses for Michael's behavior, telling myself he was just ambitious, just stressed, just going through a difficult phase that would pass with time. The retirement community I'd chosen was everything my old house hadn't been: secure, supervised, filled with people who understood what it meant to start over in the later chapters of life. My new apartment was smaller but brighter, with a view of a garden I didn't have to maintain, and neighbors who'd become friends rather than witnesses to family drama. I'd rewritten my will with Mr. Patterson's help, this time with provisions that no amount of forgery or manipulation could overcome. Michael's name was removed entirely, his children's education funds placed in an irrevocable trust that he could never access. Sarah would inherit the bulk of my estate, along with specific instructions for the charitable donations that meant more to me than any material possession. The Elder Abuse Prevention Charity was my proudest achievement, established with the money that would have gone to Michael if he'd simply waited for me to die naturally. I spoke at conferences and community centers, telling my story to audiences of seniors who nodded in recognition, and families who promised to watch for the warning signs I'd ignored for too long. 6 months after that terrible confrontation, I was sitting in my new living room reading when the mail arrived. Most days brought the usual collection of bills, advertisements, and letters from the grandchildren who'd been allowed to maintain contact despite their parents' crimes. But that Tuesday brought something different. A letter from the county jail, written in Michael's familiar handwriting. The return address made my hands shake as I opened it, not from fear, but from the complicated grief of a mother who'd lost her child to his own choices. "Dear Mom," it began, and I could almost hear his voice in the careful script. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I've done, but I'm hoping you can find it in your heart to help me with my legal fees. The public defender they assigned doesn't have time to prepare a proper defense, and Jessica's lawyer says if I can get better representation, maybe we can work out a plea deal that would let me see the kids again sooner." The letter went on for 3 pages, full of explanations and justifications, and carefully worded apologies that never quite took full responsibility for his actions. He was sorry I'd been hurt by his decisions. He regretted that the situation had gotten so complicated. He hoped I could understand that everything he'd done had been motivated by love for his family. Love for his family. Not love for me, not respect for the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, but love for the family that would benefit from my death. I set the letter aside and walked to my desk, where I kept the checkbook for my charitable foundation. The amount Michael was requesting, $5,000, would fund elder abuse prevention workshops in 3 counties, reaching hundreds of seniors who might avoid the betrayal I'd experienced. I wrote the check that afternoon, but not to Michael's legal defense fund. Instead, I mailed it to the Elder Protection Alliance with a note requesting that the donation be made in Michael Sullivan's name, along with a brief description of the crimes that had inspired my commitment to their cause. The thank you letter from the charity arrived 2 weeks later, informing me that my donation in Michael's name had funded a new program to train bank employees to recognize signs of financial elder abuse. They'd also started a support group for family members who'd been victimized by their own relatives, using my story as an example of how healing and justice could coexist. I never answered Michael's letter directly, but I did send him a copy of the charity's thank you note with a brief message of my own. Your name is now associated with helping people instead of hurting them. I hope someday you'll understand why this was the only gift I could give you. The guilt that had made me vulnerable to manipulation for so many years finally lifted on the day I mailed that note. I'd spent decades believing that a mother's love meant accepting any behavior from her children, forgiving any transgression, enabling any pattern of selfishness or cruelty in the name of family loyalty. But watching Emma and Tyler thrive in the stable home Sarah had helped create for them, seeing the difference my charity work was making in other families, feeling the peace that came from living without fear of financial or emotional manipulation. All of it had taught me that real love sometimes required the courage to say no. The phone rang that evening as I was preparing dinner in my small but efficient kitchen. Sarah's voice carried the warmth that had sustained me through the darkest days of the previous year. "Mom, "I have news," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. The school district approved my proposal for the financial literacy program. They want me to start teaching seniors about protecting themselves from scams and fraud. I told them I learned everything I needed to know from the strongest woman I've ever met. I set down my wooden spoon and felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of gratitude for the daughter who'd stood by me when everything fell apart, who'd helped me rebuild not just my life, but my faith in what family could mean when it was based on respect rather than obligation. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," I said, meaning every word. "Your father would be proud too." As I hung up the phone and returned to preparing my simple dinner, I realized that Michael's betrayal had given me something I'd never expected: the gift of discovering who I really was when I stopped defining myself through other people's needs and expectations. I was Dorothy Sullivan, survivor, advocate, and grandmother to children who would grow up understanding that love and respect were not negotiable, even within families. I was a woman who'd learned that justice and healing weren't mutually exclusive, that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable someone else's destructive choices. The emerald ring sat in its velvet box on my dresser, returned to its rightful place after months of legal proceedings. Sometimes I'd take it out and hold it up to the light, remembering my grandmother's stories about resilience and dignity in the face of hardship. She'd survived the Great Depression, raised 4 children as a widow, and lived to see her great-grandchildren born. She'd also taught me that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up, dusting yourself off and using what you'd learned to help the next person who stumbled. I was finally living a life she would have been proud of.